It was early 1942, just months after Pearl Harbor, and the Pacific had become a vast, uncharted battlefield. The United States Army Air Forces were pushing outward from Australia and New Guinea, attempting to slow Japan's relentless advance across the Pacific. Amid the roar of engines and the constant uncertainty of survival, one pilot's story would become legend and mystery. Lieutenant Thomas "Hawk" Merritt was 24 years old, a farm boy from Kansas who had earned his wings flying the new P-38 Lightning, a twin-engine fighter so fast and powerful that Japanese pilots called it two planes, one pilot. Merritt belonged to the 339th Fighter Squadron, 347th Fighter Group, based on Guadalcanal, an island that had become the center of some of the fiercest fighting in the Pacific. The mission on that fateful August morning seemed routine: escort a formation of B-17s striking enemy supply ships near the Shortland Islands. As the formation climbed to 15,000 feet, the air was clear, but the enemy was waiting. Japanese Zeros rose from Rabaul, their pilots veterans of years of combat. Dogfights erupted across the sky in twisting spirals of smoke and sunlight. Pilots called it Air Combat Ballet, a deadly dance where one wrong move meant death. Merritt, leading a section of 4 P-38s, called out over the radio, "Bandits, 2 o'clock high. Let's cut 'em off." Witnesses later recalled seeing Merritt dive through a cluster of Zeros, guns blazing. He downed one enemy fighter, possibly two. Then, a burst of tracer fire ripped through his right engine. His voice came over the radio, tense but calm. "Lost one engine. Trying to make it back." Moments later, his plane vanished into a bank of tropical clouds. There was one final transmission, barely audible, going down through cloud cover. And then silence. For the next 3 days, search crews combed the jungle-covered ridges of New Georgia and Kolumbangara. They found nothing: no wreckage, no parachute, no sign of Lieutenant Merritt or his aircraft. The P-38's twin engines could have carried it dozens of miles even after damage, but with the islands blanketed in thick canopy and the sea swallowing evidence, the search was hopeless. Official reports listed him as missing in action, but among his squadron, rumors began to spread. Some pilots swore they had seen an Allied airfield worker claiming to have spotted an American plane landing on a remote beach. Others dismissed it as hearsay. In the years that followed, Guadalcanal became synonymous with sacrifice. The 347th lost dozens of men to combat and weather alike. But Merritt's case stuck out, not because he was the only one to vanish, but because of how completely he disappeared. No oil slick, no floating debris, no radio beacon. A page from his squadron diary reads, "He was the kind of man who always came back. The quiet one. He never bragged, never hesitated. If anyone could bring a crippled Lightning home, it was Hawk Merritt." Modern historians have tried to trace his flight path using mission records and Japanese air combat logs. One theory suggests that Merritt may have been shot down over enemy territory and captured, only to die in a POW camp, records of which were later destroyed. Another theory points to navigational error. The Pacific's magnetic anomalies often threw compasses off by several degrees. In a war fought without GPS, a small deviation could mean hundreds of miles off course. Even now, satellite surveys of the Solomon Islands occasionally reveal outlines of what could be aircraft buried beneath vegetation. Some researchers believe one of those shadows may belong to Merritt's P-38. Yet, without physical confirmation, his fate remains part of the war's silent record, a symbol of courage swallowed by the vastness of the Pacific. For his family, the news came in the form of a telegram. "The War Department regrets to inform you that your son, Lieutenant Thomas E. Merritt, is missing in action." His mother reportedly kept a porch light burning for years afterward, saying, "Tom will find his way home." He never did. Today, a weathered photograph of Merritt and his P-38, named Kansas Rose, hangs in the small aviation museum at Topeka Airfield. The curator keeps a note beside it. "Still missing. Still flying." The disappearance of Lieutenant Merritt was just one among thousands, yet his story marked the beginning of a pattern that would echo through the rest of the war: brave men vanishing without explanation in skies that offered no mercy and even fewer answers. And as 1943 approached, another pilot, half a world away, would meet a fate just as mysterious in the cold and deadly skies over Europe. By 1943, the air war over Europe had become a brutal contest of endurance and courage. The U.S. 8th Air Force, based across southern England, was conducting daylight bombing raids deep into German-occupied territory. The strategy was simple yet deadly: cripple Hitler's industrial power through relentless aerial assault. But each mission into the Reich's heartland carried staggering risks: flak, fighters, freezing altitudes, and the unforgiving North Sea. Among the thousands who braved those skies was Captain James Holloway, commander of AB-17 Flying Fortress, known to his crew as Iron Bell. Holloway was 30 years old, a calm, disciplined pilot from Michigan. Before the war, he'd flown mail routes across the Midwest, quiet, precise, a man who trusted his instruments more than luck. In February 1943, his squadron, the 379th Bomb Group, received orders to strike the Focke-Wulf aircraft factories near Bremen, one of the most heavily defended targets in Germany. It was a high-altitude raid that would push both machine and man to their limits. At dawn on February 13th, 56 B-17s roared off the runways of Kimbolton Airfield, their four-engine symphony echoing across the frozen English countryside. Each bomber carried 8,000 pounds of ordnance, and 10 men who knew the odds of returning were less than half. As the formation climbed over the North Sea, contrails streaked the sky like fragile ribbons of ice. Holloway's co-pilot, Lieutenant Roy Denning, noted in his log, "Weather fair. Visibility good. Crew spirits high. Bremen in sight by 0930 hours." At 9:45 a.m., the first bursts of German flak tore through the sky. Shells exploded in black puffs, rocking the bombers in violent turbulence. Holloway's Iron Bell took a direct hit to the left wing, damaging an engine and rupturing a fuel line. "Feather number 2, he ordered calmly over the intercom. They were losing speed but held formation, dropping their bombs squarely over the target before banking north toward the North Sea. Then came the fighters. Dozens of Focke-Wulf 190s and Messerschmitt 109s dove through the bomber stream. The air turned into chaos. Holloway's gunners claimed 2 enemy planes, but their own aircraft was peppered with cannon fire. Witnesses in the trailing formation saw Iron Bell drift away from the group, trailing smoke yet still maintaining altitude. Over the radio, Holloway's final transmission crackled through. "Still flying steady. Will attempt to reach England by another route." He was never heard from again. After the mission, debrief reports were collected. The navigator of another B-17, flying 2 miles behind Holloway's, testified. He broke formation northwest of Bremen. Seemed under control. No bailout observed. Search and rescue patrols scoured the North Sea for days, but no life rafts, debris, or bodies were ever found. The official record simply noted, "Missing in action, presumed lost over sea." Yet, as the war progressed, pieces of the story began to resurface. In 1946, British investigators examining captured Luftwaffe records found no report of a crash matching Holloway's coordinates. Years later, a German fisherman from Cuxhaven claimed that, during that winter, he saw a large aircraft gliding low over the water, engines silent, heading north. The description fit a B-17, perhaps Iron Bell, making a desperate run for home. What's more intriguing is what surfaced in 1987 when Dutch divers off the Frisian Islands discovered fragments of a 4-engine bomber lying 60 feet beneath the waves. Serial numbers were partially legible, enough to identify it as a Boeing B-17, but the tail designation didn't match any aircraft officially lost over the area. Some historians suspect it might have been Holloway's plane, though no human remains were ever recovered. Holloway's family was left with a cruel uncertainty. His wife, Margaret, received his final letter days after the mission, a brief note written before takeoff. "If this reaches you, it means I've done my duty. Don't worry for me. Worry for the boys who follow." She would never remarry. The story of Iron Bell became a haunting legend among bomber crews stationed in East Anglia. Some said Holloway had deliberately flown north to avoid ditching near the German coast, hoping to reach neutral Sweden. Others suggested he'd tried to land on the sea ice forming near Denmark, only for the aircraft to sink beneath the thaw. Officially, his crew remains missing, presumed dead, their names etched on the wall of the missing at Cambridge American Cemetery. In the decades since, every new fragment of evidence, every sonar scan, every eyewitness recollection raises more questions than answers. Was Iron Bell brought down by damage, or did Holloway try to save his men in one last act of defiance? The North Sea keeps its secrets, and in its cold silence lies the fate of Captain Holloway and his crew. But as one mystery faded into the fog of Europe's northern coast, another was taking shape across the Atlantic, one involving a daring ferry pilot, a raging storm, and a flight that vanished into thin air. The North Atlantic in 1943 was among the most perilous routes of the Second World War. Not just for the merchant convoys braving U-boat-infested waters, but for the pilots who ferried aircraft across the ocean alone, often through storms that could swallow entire squadrons. It was a path that claimed hundreds of airmen, many of whom vanished without trace. One of them was Lieutenant Eleanor Ellie Carter, one of the very few women entrusted with ferrying new warplanes from North America to Britain. Carter served with the Air Transport Auxiliary, the ATA, a civilian organization under military control that employed male and female pilots to deliver aircraft to the front. They flew everything from nimble Spitfires to heavy bombers, often without radios, maps, or even reliable weather forecasts. Carter had logged over 400 hours by 1943, flying routes from factory airstrips in Montreal and Gander to RAF bases across Scotland and northern England. Her skill and precision earned her the respect of hardened air crews who still doubted women belonged in cockpits. If Ellie said she could fly it, recalled one ATA mechanic years later. On October 21, 1943, Carter was tasked with one of the most challenging ferry missions of the war, delivering a Lockheed Hudson light bomber from Newfoundland to Prestwick, Scotland, a 2,000-mile flight over the icy Atlantic. It was meant to be a routine transfer, escorted by weather guidance from RAF Ferry Command. She lifted off from Gander Airfield at 0700 hours, climbing steadily into an overcast sky. Her last radio contact came 2 hours later, passing waypoint at 54 north, 42 west. Visibility poor, but holding steady. Then nothing. By midday, a massive cold front had moved in from Greenland, spawning hurricane-force winds and sheets of freezing rain. Other pilots on similar routes reported violent turbulence and near-zero visibility. One veteran ferry pilot described it as flying through a wall of black water. Carter's aircraft, laden with fuel, would have been buffeted mercilessly, the cockpit instruments fogging as ice crept across the windshield. When she failed to arrive at Prestwick by nightfall, RAF Coastal Command launched search missions from Iceland and Scotland. For 3 days, Liberator patrol planes swept the North Atlantic, scanning for wreckage or a life raft. Nothing was ever found, not an oil slick, not a signal flare, not a single trace of the Hudson or its pilot. On October 24th, the search was called off. Official cause: severe weather, probable loss at sea. Yet, as years passed, Carter's disappearance became more than a mere entry in wartime records. Her case file contained unusual details. Radio logs indicated an unconfirmed transmission from a pilot calling Mayday on the RAF distress frequency, roughly 2 hours after her last known position. The voice was faint, distorted, but one technician insisted it was female. The signal vanished moments later, its origin somewhere over the open ocean between Greenland and Ireland. In 1959, a Canadian fishing vessel trawling near the Labrador coast recovered fragments of aluminum bearing partial RAF serial markings. They were consistent with a Lockheed Hudson, though never conclusively linked to Carter's aircraft. The find reignited public interest in her story, sparking debates among historians. Some speculated her plane may have ditched intact, drifting for days before sinking beneath the waves. Others proposed she had turned north, attempting to follow the storm to Iceland, a maneuver that, in theory, might have saved her had the weather not worsened. Her ATA contemporaries kept her memory alive. Flight Officer Margaret Frost, a close friend, wrote in her memoir, "Eleanor flew with a kind of quiet certainty. She once told me, 'You can't fight the wind, you learn to move with it.' Perhaps that's how she met her end, fighting the sky until there was no more sky to fight." Today, the flight records at Gander's North Atlantic Aviation Museum include a single page marked in faded pencil, "Lieutenant Carter, Hudson FW, 981, departed 0700/overdue." That's all that remains of one of the most skilled pilots the ATA ever produced. In 2003, oceanographers using sonar imaging in the same sector where Carter disappeared detected what appeared to be the remains of a twin-engine aircraft lying upright on the seabed, buried under decades of silt. Attempts to investigate were halted by weather and cost. The site remains undisturbed, a cold monument to a vanished pilot who braved the same skies as her male counterparts and paid the same price. Lieutenant Eleanor Carter's story is a reminder that courage in wartime had no gender, no nationality, only resolve. Yet her vanishing also deepened the larger enigma forming around Allied air losses, skilled pilots, sound aircraft, and missions that ended in silence. As the war intensified into 1944, another pilot, this time over the clouded battlefields of occupied France, would meet a similarly haunting fate. By 1944, the skies over Europe were an endless roar of engines and gunfire. The Allies had gained air superiority, but at a terrible cost. For every successful bombing raid or fighter escort, dozens of men never returned. Among the missing was one of the 8th Air Force's most daring squadron leaders, Major Robert "Bobby" Gaines of the 56th Fighter Group, a unit famed for its relentless attacks on enemy aircraft and supply convoys. Born in Chicago and raised during the Great Depression, Gaines had joined the Army Air Corps in 1941 and quickly distinguished himself as a skilled and fearless pilot. Flying the rugged P-47 Thunderbolt, he earned the nickname Iron Wing after surviving 2 bailouts and returning to duty within weeks. He wasn't reckless, just fearless in the face of impossible odds. "You didn't fly with Gaines," one of his men said. "You followed him." By the spring of 1944, his group was operating from RAF Boxstead in Essex, flying deep penetration escort missions for the massive bomber fleets striking German targets in preparation for the Normandy invasion. On April 12, 1944, Gaines led 12 Thunderbolts on an escort mission over occupied France. The target, a rail junction near Tours used by the Wehrmacht to move reinforcements to the Atlantic coast. It was supposed to be routine. It wasn't. Takeoff was at 0745 hours. Conditions were ideal, clear skies over the channel, light cloud cover inland. At approximately 10:15 a.m., over the Loire Valley, German radar stations detected the formation. Within minutes, Focke-Wulf 190 fighters from Jägerschwader II were scrambled to intercept. Combat began near Le Mans. Radio transcripts from that morning reveal Gaines's calm voice. "Blue leader engaging. 2 bogeys high at 10 o'clock. Keep it tight, boys." In the chaos of battle, eyewitnesses saw Gaines dive into a pair of 190s that were harassing a damaged B-24. He downed one before his own aircraft was hit. Flames trailed from his right wing, yet he maintained control, turning sharply, then vanishing into low cloud cover. His last words crackled through the static. "Taking her down. See you on the ground." That was the last anyone ever heard of Major Robert Gaines. For weeks, Allied intelligence scoured German intercepts and POW lists for his name. Nothing. No radio contact, no wreckage, no captured pilot matching his description. The French resistance, operating across the Loire Valley, was asked to keep watch for downed airmen. In late May, a report filtered through their network. A local farmer claimed to have seen an American fighter crash near Saint-Aignan, followed days later by German trucks removing wreckage under heavy guard. The site was sealed off, and no civilians were permitted near it again. After the liberation of France in August 1944, investigators from the Missing Air Crew Office, MACR 40109, visited the area. The crash site had been burned and bulldozed. No serial numbers were recovered. The only clue, a single, bent dog tag found buried in the soil, bore the faint inscription R. Gaines. It was never conclusively verified as authentic. Post-war German records, declassified decades later, mention an unidentified U.S. pilot captured alive near Tours the same day Gaines went missing. The entry was marked, transferred to Dulag Luft, but carried no further documentation. The trail ended there. Some historians believe Gaines may have been interrogated, possibly even executed, before his capture could be officially recorded. Others think he may have been hidden by the resistance and killed during a German counter-raid in the weeks before D-Day. In 1998, a French researcher named Étienne Roussel claimed to have discovered fragments of a P-47's engine near the original crash coordinates. Metallurgical tests dated the debris to 1944. But there were hundreds of aircraft lost in that region during the same period, and no unique identifiers tied the wreckage to Gaines's Thunderbolt. His file remains officially unresolved. Major Gaines's story embodies both the valor and the enigma of the air war over Europe. His unit, the Wolfpack of the 56th Fighter Group, went on to destroy more enemy aircraft than any other in the 8th Air Force. Yet their fearless leader's disappearance still casts a long shadow. In the squadron ready room, his locker was never reassigned. Above it, someone had pinned a single piece of paper that simply read, "He'll be back." Today, the village of St. Ignan holds a small annual ceremony honoring Allied airmen lost over their skies. Among the names read aloud each year is Major Robert Gaines, a man whose courage never wavered and whose fate remains a haunting question buried beneath French soil. But as the war neared its bloody conclusion in 1945 and Europe began to breathe again, the mystery of missing pilots refused to fade. Across the Pacific and the Atlantic alike, families waited for news that would never come. For some, the telegrams were final. For others, the story was just beginning. By early 1945, the world was on the brink of victory, but for countless Allied families, the war's end brought no peace. For every celebrated homecoming, there were dozens of names left unspoken, etched instead into the marble of memorial walls. Among them were 5 pilots, brave, disciplined, and devoted, whose disappearances had come to symbolize the war's unrelenting uncertainty. As the guns quieted, questions still echoed. Where did they go, and what had really happened in those final moments? In the spring of that year, as Germany collapsed from within, the U.S. Army Air Forces turned their focus to one of the most dangerous missions of all, low-level reconnaissance. The aim was to document damage from months of bombing, track retreating Wehrmacht units, and locate remaining prisoner-of-war camps. Among the pilots selected for these missions was Captain Daniel "Danny" Walsh, a veteran reconnaissance flyer from the 9th Tactical Air Command. Walsh had survived over 70 combat sorties in his P-51 Mustang, nicknamed Lucky Lady, and was respected for his calm precision under pressure. On March 22, 1945, Captain Walsh departed from an airstrip near Maastricht, Netherlands, tasked with photographing German troop movements along the Rhine. The region had become a chaotic maze of shattered bridges, anti-aircraft fire, and retreating German convoys. His orders were to fly low, fast, and return within 2 hours. Weather was clear. His plane was in perfect condition. At 0930 hours, Allied radar tracked his aircraft crossing into German airspace near Remagen, the same sector where American forces had recently seized the famous Ludendorff Bridge. Radio logs recorded his voice briefly. Rhine in sight. Heavy movement on the east bank. Beginning photo run. Then, static. 10 minutes later, another pilot flying 20 miles north reported seeing a single P-51, smoke trailing from the tail, flying erratic but still under control, before it disappeared into the morning haze. Search teams found no wreckage. German prisoners later claimed that an American plane had been shot down nearby on that day, but no remains or equipment were ever recovered. In 1946, a debriefing from a captured Luftwaffe anti-aircraft officer mentioned, a Mustang forced down intact east of the Rhine, and a pilot taken into custody by SS troops. But post-war POW lists contain no record of Captain Walsh. His family received the same sterile notice delivered to thousands of others: missing in action. For decades, the story lingered as a loose thread in wartime archives. Then, in 1978, construction workers excavating a wooded ridge near the German village of Judenbach unearthed fragments of aluminum and an oxygen tank bearing faint markings: Yuzov P-51. Forensic experts from the U.S. Army's Joint POW MIA Accounting Command examined the site, but were unable to confirm an identity. No serial number, no remains, just metal fragments, rusted and silent. Some historians believe Walsh was captured and executed in the final chaotic days of the Reich. Others propose that his Mustang crashed during a desperate escape attempt, possibly after mechanical failure or fuel starvation. But without physical evidence, his fate remains unresolved, one of countless ghosts in the closing chapter of the war. In a 1945 journal entry recovered from a fellow pilot, an unnamed officer wrote, "The Rhine looks peaceful from above, but it eats airplanes like the sea. One moment you're there, the next gone." Maybe that's how Walsh went, swallowed by the fog and the war's last breath. For his parents back in Iowa, the war ended in silence. Each spring, his mother laid fresh flowers beneath a framed photograph of her son in uniform, a letter still tucked behind the glass. It read simply, "Don't worry, Mom. I'll be back when the job's done." Walsh's disappearance joined the long list of unsolved wartime vanishings, a list that stretched from the Pacific's coral atolls to the North Atlantic's black depths and across the battlefields of Europe. As archives slowly opened over the decades, patterns emerged: 5 pilots, 5 aircraft, 5 disappearances separated by oceans but linked by eerie similarities. No distress calls, no wreckage, no conclusive endings. Modern historians refer to them collectively as the Vanishing Five, a term that captures both their courage and their mystery. Their stories reveal more than tactical data or operational risk. They expose the fragile line between bravery and oblivion in the world's deadliest conflict. And yet, even after the victory parades ended and the banners faded, the families never stopped asking. Somewhere out there, they believed their sons and daughters might still rest beneath the skies they once commanded. As 1945 gave way to peace, recovery teams began returning to old battlefields and forgotten islands, searching for clues, for closure, for truth. What they found would only deepen the mystery. The war had ended. Across Europe and the Pacific, silence settled, where once the air thundered with bombers and fighters. Families waited for returning heroes, telegrams in trembling hands. But for thousands, among them the families of Merritt, Holloway, Carter, Gaines, and Walsh, there was no return, no gravesite, only uncertainty. They had all vanished into the skies of war, their fates scattered among oceans and forests. It was 1945, and the world was rebuilding, yet these 5 names became enduring echoes in the archives of the missing. In the immediate post-war years, U.S. Army Graves Registration and the newly formed American Graves Commission began the painstaking task of locating missing airmen. Thousands of aircraft had gone down across Europe, Asia, and the Pacific, many in remote areas never seen by Allied ground troops. Each discovery brought hope, each unmarked crash site a reminder of how many were still lost. "It's as if the war itself swallowed them," one investigator remarked. "The sky took them, and the earth kept their secrets." In 1948, recovery teams searching through dense jungle on Bougainville Island in the Solomons found a rusted P-38 Lightning buried beneath thick canopy. The serial numbers were partially legible, but not enough to confirm it as Lieutenant Merritt's. Inside the cockpit, they found a corroded dog tag, the letters too worn to read. The find reignited questions that had lain dormant for 6 years. Was this the Kansas Rose, Merritt's fighter? Or just one of dozens that fell in those same deadly skies? Similar investigations unfolded across Europe. In 1951, A British salvage vessel off the Dutch coast retrieved a B-17 bomber fuselage from the seabed. The number on the tail was faded but close to Iron Bell's designation. No remains were found inside. Divers described the interior as eerily preserved, flight jackets still buckled, a rusted clipboard floating in the cockpit. Yet without a clear serial match, the identification was never confirmed. For Captain Holloway's widow, Margaret, the news reopened wounds that had never healed. She later told a journalist, "It's strange, after all this time, part of me still listens for his plane." In 1962, a research vessel mapping ocean currents near Greenland detected a faint metallic anomaly nearly 3,000 feet below the surface. The coordinates corresponded almost exactly to Lieutenant Eleanor Carter's last known transmission. Funding ran dry before a recovery dive could be made. To this day, that signal remains uninvestigated, one blip on a sonar screen that might hold the final chapter of her story. Major Gaines's trail resurfaced in 1980 when French farmers near St. Aignan uncovered a small metal plate while plowing, its engraving read P-47D, Boxstead. Local historians contacted the U.S. Air Force, but the site had already been disturbed. Whatever clues it once held were lost to time and the soil's corrosion. Even now, each summer, a small flag appears beside that field, placed anonymously, with no note attached. As for Captain Danny Walsh, the case file remained sealed until 1993, when declassified German documents from the final weeks of the war revealed a single entry from an SS unit near Bonn. Captured American pilot, identity unknown, executed during withdrawal. The description matched Walsh's uniform and aircraft markings. Yet no remains were ever found. Officially, the case remains open. Across decades, these fragments tell a larger story, not of loss alone, but of resilience. Each vanished pilot became a symbol of those countless others who never came home. Their names are etched into stone at memorials in Cambridge, Manila, Honolulu, and Normandy. Under missing, they remain perpetually on duty, their watch unending. The historian and airman Charles Mayfield once wrote, "When a plane goes down and leaves no trace, it doesn't disappear, it becomes part of the sky. The sky remembers everything." Perhaps that's the only solace left for those families who never received answers. Today, modern search teams equipped with ground-penetrating radar and satellite imaging still comb through jungles, ocean floors, and mountainsides. Each discovery, a twisted propeller, a fragment of wing, rekindles the war's long-fading stories. Sometimes, dog tags surface, names return to families decades later. But for many, including these 5, the mystery endures. They represent more than unexplained disappearances. They embody the fragile line between duty and oblivion, between courage and chance. In every photograph, their youth is eternal, frozen in sepia skies. Lieutenant Merritt, Captain Holloway, Lieutenant Carter, Major Gaines, and Captain Walsh. 5 courageous pilots who flew into war and never came back. Their aircraft may have perished, their bodies lost, but their legacy remains suspended between cloud and memory. Even now, when historians revisit their missions, they do so not in search of tragedy, but truth. For as long as there are eyes to look upward, the missing of World War II are never truly gone. Somewhere, above the roar of history, they are still flying.